Welcome to a seminar on Paper 1, Section 1. This seminar is designed to prepare and guide you through the process to ensure that you achieve maximum marks in this section. When you first receive your question and answer booklet and stimulus, you will find that there are instructions. It's very important that you read these instructions first and then take note of your reading time. You've got 10 minutes reading time. Now, within this reading time, there is no annotating and no underlining allowed. You should not have a pen in your hand. Now, historically, some students have decided to read all questions and then look at all stimulus in one sort of fell swoop. I would propose and recommend that you read one question at a time and then examine the stimulus for that question. That will allow you then to sort of skim read during that time and to identify examples from that stimulus based on the question that you've just read. And once you are clear with your examples and evidence that you're going to use, move on to the next question. So for example, text 1, question 1, read question 1 first, then examine text 1. It's also advised to answer the question in the line spaces provided. Now, there are opportunities for students to ask for extra writing booklets if needs be. However, it is expected that you are able to complete a full mark response to said question in those line spaces. Now, if you can write in those line spaces and indeed get more writing booklets and finish within time, fantastic. However, these line spaces are designed to help you to finish in time and effectively. So let's look at some of the questions that occurred in last year's HSC 2020. Question 1 was an unusual one, actually. It had two texts on the one page, an internet article and also an illustration, with the question, how do these texts use a variety of language forms and features to communicate ideas about being creative? Now, this was a 5-mark question. A bit of a curly one because students were not expecting a 5-mark or a comparative response for their first question, yet the results have shown that the students adapted well to this curly question. Here you have the first text, which is the internet article, and then you have the second text, which is an illustration. I'll let you pause this in your own time so you can look at these stimuli. Now, in better responses for this question, whereby the students had to answer, how do these texts use a variety of language forms and features to communicate ideas about being creative? So there's that plural aspect there. So it's language forms and features to communicate ideas, okay, about being creative. So in the better responses, students were able to clearly explain how the texts communicated ideas about being creative using detailed evidence from both texts. Okay, so both texts. So a minimum 2 examples and techniques from each text that communicate ideas about being creative were in their response. But the better responses, students were able to demonstrate an understanding of storytelling, creativity, and the construction of creative texts. Areas to improve included demonstrating an understanding of the ways in which the specific language forms and features of each text convey ideas about being creative. Now, point of note, as the short answers of the section 1 are not looked at with great regularity within normal timetable classes. It's strongly advised that you revive your visual techniques, your literary techniques, your poetic devices, so that you're able to identify and then sort of see how these texts are effective in conveying a message that the composer is seeking to convey in addressing the question. So if you're unsure of these techniques, devices, it is imperative that you start to refresh your memory on them. So again, linked to that, it says where students need to improve providing relevant and judiciously selected textual references that support the ideas about being creative, and ensure that both texts are addressed in a reasonably balanced manner. Now, because this is a comparative and it's, there's two texts in there, it is vital that a balance is achieved. Absolutely vital. So don't focus on one text over the other. A 50-50 split is expected. And for 5 marker, you tend to get approximately 3/4 to a full page of the lined area. So it's recommended that you aim to fill that for every response. So here's a sample answer to question 1. So as I put on the screen, can you identify examples and techniques? Obviously, you can pause this while you read. So there's a sample answer below, which has been color-coded. And I've color-coded the question being addressed in pink. I've color-coded a technique in orange, and I've color-coded a quote or an example in green. Now again, this is a example that you should be looking to repeat for yourself as you seek to answer each and every question in this short answer section. So for example, these texts use a variety of language forms and features to communicate ideas about how being creative not only requires dedication, effort, and being open to the world, but also brings joy and satisfaction through the act of creating. So the question's been addressed straight away. Then we see, for example, Frayn's clear, almost practical voice. There's your technique. Details that writers are lured on. That's your quotation. Ideas that come into their heads. Frayn conveys the ideas that being creative, there's the question, requires hard work, but describing how does not a life of great freedom, another quotation. We'll just move on then towards the, I suppose, the bottom here, where we're looking at saying the illustration with its symbols of the bird and pencil highlights how art and creativity bring freedom and joy to individuals. The journey of creativity, with its sense of discovering rich new ideas and unknown aspects of the world, again, is depicted in the illustration through the sea of flowing poetic words that keeps the smiling, content writer afloat. Now, you can clearly see that the question has been addressed consistently within this short response. Consistently. Not just at the start of the paragraph or at the end of the paragraph, but throughout. Now, I'm not saying that this is a number that you need to repeat going forward, but I can count 8 references to creativity or creative or invention within this sample answer. So it's a consistent linking back to the question. And let's move on to question 2, which was text 3, because text 1 and text 2 were in the first question. And it was a poem, and the poem, the wording of the question comes directly from the Text and Human Experiences rubric. So how does the poem explore the power of storytelling? And it's a 5 marker. Now, point to note, when we see the word how, we should be looking at techniques, devices, etc. So I've just taken screenshots of the poem. Now, this was quite a long poem, and you can clearly see that there are 4 screenshots there on the screen for you to look at and to read in your own time. So feel free to pause the video now so you can do that. So, in better responses, students were able to provide an effective explanation of how the poem explores the power of storytelling using relevant textual evidence. So for a top-end response, 5 marks, aim for 4 examples with techniques to explore the power of storytelling. And then we see how better responses students were able to demonstrate an understanding of how the power of storytelling involves a movement from dislocation to connection. So that change, that shift that occurs. Okay, so it's like when we talk about, let's say if you're looking at an imaginative piece of writing, we're always telling you guys to focus on character development. Move that shift from point A to point B. So what happens to that individual moving from point A to point B, how that affects them. So it's the same thing here. You need to think about how there's a movement from dislocation to connection. And an area for students to improve, there were a few here whereby students needed to address how the power of storytelling is explored through the use of specific language forms and features. Again, there you go. These are literary techniques, devices that you need to be incorporating within your response. But again, how the power of storytelling, this is addressing the question here. And how to consider complexities of the text in terms of emotions that emerge from shared and personal experiences. When we're thinking about emotions, or even that shift, you can think about your spiritual, you think about your physical, your intellectual, your cultural, your emotional change, as it says here. And then students need to demonstrate an understanding of the broad range of human experiences explored in the poem. So you need to be able to delve into the text, and you need to be able to showcase your understanding of what's happening within the text and how you can link it back to the question at hand. So with this question, so with this 5-mark question, the focus is on one text, this poem, and it is quite a long poem. Okay, so you should always read the poem, or any text really, you should always read the poem at least twice before even writing a response. And things you need to look at. So can you identify the power of storytelling? Can you use these examples? And again, aim to fill 3/4 to the full page of the lined area in 4 marks. So, as previous, here is a sample answer to said question. So, can you identify examples and poetic devices? I haven't color-coded this, and this is up to you now to sort of go through and see if you can identify some examples and poetic devices that can be linked back to the question, which was how does the poem explore the power of storytelling? So let's look at it. Sandy Kassan's poem, It Begins with Darkness, details a father's first encounter with his son's performance as an actor, using images of light and darkness to depict the transformative effect the evening has on the father. The first stanza establishes the theatre as a place of storytelling, and the father's sense of dislocation and displacement through, I don't know what I'm doing here, I just know that this is theatre, my son is an actor. The father is characterized through his depiction as a boiler maker who exults in the flying sparks from an arc welder, and someone who recognizes his son's performance is a different kind of trade. However, Kassan gradually removes the father's sense of dislocation through highlighting the effect his son's performance and the story being told on stage has on him. So if we go back to the notes there, we can sort of see how there was a change, there was a shift in the father. There's a movement from dislocation to connection. So he moves from wanting to go down and slap him about the face because of his swearing, he wanting to reach out and lift him up as I did when he was 2. The final image of the burning scrap of paper illuminating his son's face and revealing the unmistakable features of my father who is 10 years dead creates a powerful resolution that binds the 3 generations of men together through a story that takes a whole evening in the telling. So take a moment, go back, read through this sample answer and see if you can identify the consistent addressing of the question. Is there quotations? Are there poetic devices? If they're not specifically named, is there allusion to certain devices? And this can be rewarded when we look at a piece holistically, but it's always strongly advised to have a number of devices and techniques within your analysis. But you can clearly see here that that there is an effective explanation of how the poem explores the power of storytelling. And if you look at the textual evidence that's used here, it's quite judicious. Okay, and first and foremost, can I just say that the first example that's being used here is from the first stanza. Okay, you should always aim to find an example or evidence from any text from the beginning of said text. Okay, it is not advised to start analysis, let's say, for this poem in stanza 3. Okay, you need to be starting beginning of the poem and working your way through in order to sort of demonstrate your understanding of how the power of storytelling is displayed within this poem. Now we're going to move on to question 3, which is text 4. This was a non-fiction extract. The question, explain how this text examines the human experience of laughter. Okay, and this was a 4-mark question. Explain how this text examines the human experience of laughter. Again, this has been taken directly from the Text and Human Experiences rubric. If you're not familiar with the rubric, please go back and revise it. So you can see here that text 4 is quite concise. And for a 4-mark question, this is an opportunity for students to get those runs on the board, to get those points up on the board for themselves. So it's important that when you get a text like this, even though it's short and concise, you will be able to sort of recognize that this extract is rich in examples and evidence that can be linked back to the question, which is how this text here examines the human experience of laughter. You can pause this page, this slide I should say, just so you can read through this extract and see how this text examines the human experience of laughter. Some of the better responses to this question, students are able to clearly explain the multifaceted experience of laughter using detailed supporting evidence. So for a top-end response, you should aim for, because it's a 4-marker, you should aim for at least 3 examples with techniques that examine the human experience of laughter. Better responses, students engaged actively with the text and provided examples of how different types of laughter convey the multiple human experiences and emotions. So as you know, as a bare minimum, at least 2 types were required here. And areas to improve included that detailed explanations and relevant textual evidence. Students need to provide a clear view on human experience and laughter that moves beyond just restating the question. Okay, so not just talking about how the author examines the human experience of laughter. Don't just use the word of the question word for word, the wording of the question word for word, I should say. And finally, students have to improve demonstrating an understanding of the human experience or experiences in the text. So I think that sometimes some of these experiences that are being conveyed within the text, while seemingly quite obvious, were not listed in responses. So with this non-fiction extract, look, it was, as I said, it was short, it was concise. As per the recommended strategy, read the question first. Okay, so you have an idea about what you're looking for in that response. The question was about examining the human experience of laughter. So you're going to have laughter in your head, then read through the stimulus at least 2 times before you write the response. So what you should have been doing is, can you identify the human experience of laughter, and then the techniques throughout. So again, here is a sample answer. And let's look at it. In On Laughter, Eagleton examines how the human reaction of laughter is something that has a language of its own, how it is remarkably fluid, lacks uniformity, and can be completely divorced from humor. He paraphrases Samuel Johnson to initialize his theses, disagreeing with the statement that humans have always laughed in the same way, accumulating an extensive list of adjectives to detail the different ways in which humans laugh. Cackling, chortling, grunting, with some ellipses here, screeching, and so on. This almost exhaustive list is also designed to amuse and engage our senses through detailing the wonderful variety of ways that people laugh. Eagleton's distinction between smiling as a visual mode and laughter as an oral mode is designed to communicate the complex reactions humans have to a complex world. His short piece concludes with examples of how one way of describing a person's laugh can be performed by a person in 2 completely different ways. He combines the verb bray with 2 opposing adverbs, genially and aggressively, to demonstrate how difficult it is to pin down the way the language of laughter works. So look, overall, this was a fiction extract that was rich in examples and was quite clear and straightforward. The issue here for many in the Marking Centre was whether they were being concise enough to fit content into approximately 1-lined page. Okay, so you can clearly see here sample answer that ticks all the boxes with addressing the question, giving examples, giving devices, and it's about giving that sort of minimal element of doubt that a marker could have about giving a student 4 marks. And this is what we want you to do. We want you to strive for, for a 4 marker, at least 3 examples with techniques, so that there is no element of you not getting full marks for a question in this short answer section. And then we come across question 4, which is text 5. This is this prose fiction extract. Now this was a 6-mark question whereby it asks the students to analyze the ways this text represents the relationship between identity and place. So when you look at that question, you got to read through it, okay? You got to make sure you're clear about what you're being asked and how you're going to answer this question. So analyze the ways, plural. This text represents the relationship between identity and place. So you need to talk about the relationship between identity and place. Okay, so if students only looked at identity or they only looked at place, they would have straight away been discounted from entering into anything, I would say, over 4 marks, okay, depending on the piece of work. So it's so important that you read the question fully and that you take care in writing about what the question's asking you to do. So let's look at the prose fiction extract. Now again, I've taken a couple of screenshots, but this kind of translated to approximately 1 page of content for this stimulus. Okay, so apologies if it's a little bit squished in there, but it's the best I could do, so we can get it all on one screen. So feel free now to pause the screen for yourself and read through it again more than once to ensure that you're clear about what this stimulus is all about, but also the question. Remember the question. Analyze the ways this text represents the relationship between identity and place. So can you identify identity? Can you identify place? And can you see a relationship between identity and place? Read through this in your own time. So once you've read through the response and sort of trying to sort of create a written response to the question of how this text represents the relationship between identity and place, 6 marker, better response if students were able to demonstrate strong understanding of the relationship between identity and place. So for example, this is a mini essay format. There was a addressing of the question immediately, and there was a clear voice throughout the response, and there was absolutely no page filler at all. One thing you need to be clear about when you're writing is that you are quite sort of frugal with your words. Okay, you need to make sure that every word you use within your response has purpose. Okay, we do not want in this section. We do not want to sort of read about your musings about certain topics or ideas. Just stick to the text. Engage with the question and articulate those ideas with clarity and depth. Okay, there's no page filler necessary here. We want you to be as concise as possible with an answer that is on point, has judicious evidence and analysis to help you answer the question. Okay, we do not want you to list your examples or to list your techniques. So you need to make sure that you are forming a cohesive response. You're using connectives, right, within each of your examples. So you're using terminology such as furthermore, moreover, etc. Okay. Too often we see students are just listing examples, skipping a line and going one example linked to the question with the technique, but there's no flow or sort of coherency between all of those examples and their full response. So that lack of coherency can affect chances of getting a top mark. So for areas to improve, again, describing or recounting elements of the text, okay? And analyzing the representation of the relationship between identity and place in the extract and how this may involve multiple levels of human connection. Okay, so when you look at it, this was a fiction extract. There was 1 page of content to analyze. So this extract should have been read at least twice, of course course, this is something you need to get into the habit of doing, which means that you need to start thinking about this process when you're engaging with time management for this section. Okay. Sometimes if we read through stimulus too quickly or without due care, we can miss examples earlier in the piece. Okay, or we could miss examples in the middle of the piece, so we could have examples only from the beginning and the end of the piece. Okay, so you need to be clear about what you're trying to identify. So here we're trying to identify identity, we're trying to identify place, and then you're going to look to identify a relationship between both texts, or both aspects, excuse me, of the question. Okay, and again, addressing that question consistently, not just topping and tailing at the start of a paragraph or the end of a paragraph. Remember, to the first example I highlighted to you, there were 8 references to the question. Slight overkill, but it was still an excellent response. So then, when we look at the ways this text represents the relationship between identity and place, can you now identify, or can you see why this answer below received full marks? Throughout this extract from Carpentaria, Alexis Wright establishes the complex relationship between identity and place, juxtaposing the everyday and the supernatural, using Normal, an old tribal man who lives in a foreign infestation on the edge of Desperance. Wright details the relationship between identity and place through the connection Normal has with sea and sky that has been passed down to him by his ancestors. A connection that allows him to grab hold of the river in his mind and live with it as his fathers' fathers did before him. This spiritual connection with land, combined with an ability to run off into the night trying to catch stars, is something Wright describes to ensure Normal's identity is connected with both the present and the past. While Wright's use of third-person narrative has the potential to distance us from Normal, it also allows her to shift the point of view so that we see him from a number of different perspectives, through the eyes of the Pricklebush mob, the people of the town of Desperance, and the eyes of everyone. Wright uses this third-person perspective to give us a wider view of how people view Normal as he drives north to meet the river's edge. It also allows her to focus in on the places that we have heard about, but no one else has gone to, his gun pointing all over the place in a turmoil of water, until he made a direct hit between the eyes of the reptile caught in an instant of moonlight. So read through this sample response yourself again and see if you can identify links to the question. Can you identify identity? Can you identify place? Can you see how there's a relationship between identity and place? Can you see how there's commentary on the author's craft, their style, the voice that they use, and the reasons why? Okay, or even the hypotheses as to why they've used this. So read through it yourself. See if you can identify how this text represents the relationship between identity and place in this response. So, for those of you who, you're always, well, there are a selection of students who tend to try and, predict what comes up in the HSC. And, look, for me, it can be entertaining at times when we try and sort of look to guess what questions are coming up. But to be fair, we don't really have any idea what type of questions are going to occur. Or the type of stimuli that the NES are going to use within the short answer section. However, one thing we can look at is over the last couple of years through this new curriculum and through the new HSC format, one thing we can look at is the wording of questions from that sort of paper 1 section 1, the short answer section. So Let's just look at it here. Question 1 talks about communicate ideas, about being creative. Okay, so there's communication in there, ideas is in there, and creative or creativity is in there. I think if you recall in the model response, there was the word of invention that was in there. Okay. Look at question 2. There was the power of storytelling. This is a question or a phrasing that you should be very familiar with, as it's been used within previous short answer questions that you've seen before, either in year 11 or even indeed in year 12. Question 3 talked about the human experience of laughter. Okay, well, straight away we see human experience there. This is a common module called Texts and Human Experiences, and of course laughter. Okay, so there's that human experience that is something that we encounter hopefully every day. And then question 4 was that relationship between identity and place. Now, this wording of questions, it's they're not the most difficult questions, and I think they're really accessible for all students. And you got to remember here that the wording that is being used within this paper 1 section 1 common module, bar a couple of questions, they're the same wordings for the English Standard, the English Advanced, English Studies, and the EALD. So there's going to be questions that are quite accessible for all students in the state, regardless of whatever English subject they are studying. So, communication, creativity, storytelling, human experience, relationship, identity, place. Where have we seen these words or phrasings or similar words to these before? We have seen them in the text and human experiences rubric. Okay, so I have highlighted and color-coded some here. So if we look at here in the common module, students deepen their understanding of how texts represent individual and collective human experiences. Look at how texts represent human qualities and emotions associated with or arising from these experiences. How texts may give insight into the anomalies, paradoxes, and inconsistencies in human behavior and motivations, inviting the responder to see the world differently, to challenge assumptions, ignite new ideas, or reflect personally. Now, if you want to think back to the stimulus whereby in the poem where you had the father going through his, I suppose, dislocation to connection, there's that, how individuals or how it allows us to see the world differently. There you go, the role of storytelling, okay, to express and reflect particular lives and cultures, your various literary devices, of course, human experiences, but even to go back to look at context, purpose, structure, stylistic, grammatical features, and form, how they all shape meaning. Okay, how they all shape meaning. And of course, different modes and media use, visual, verbal, and digital language elements. Look, when we look at short answer section 1, we historically, I'm not saying this is going to happen all the time, but historically, an image can be used, a poem can be used, 2 poems can be used, non-fiction extract can be used, or 2 non-fiction extracts, and of course fiction extracts or 2 fiction extracts can be used. We've no idea what type of texts are going to come up in the HSC or for your upcoming trials, but what we can do is we can give you some advice. And that key advice, okay, it's something that it's highly recommended that you take all of this on board and you act on it. Okay, this whole seminar would be entirely pointless if you don't act on what has been outlined here, because after all, this is designed to help you achieve the best you can in your upcoming trials, but then also in the HSC. So it's a question I get asked an awful a lot of the time by students about what should I do with paper 1? Should I do the shorties first or should I do section 2? Right? So should I do the crucible first or should I do section 1 first? I would always recommend to do the paper in order. Okay, I would always try and get those runs on the board or get those marks on the board with section 1. Section 1, 20 marks. It is one of the most accessible 20 marks you can get. Now, and for me, it's a bit silly to spend more time on section 2 than on section 1 when both section 1 and section 2 are worth the exact same marks. Okay, so you need to come up with a strategy now, right? You need to come up with a strategy whereby you're going to use the reading time to the best of your ability. Okay, so you're going to read the question. Okay, be clear on what you need to address in your response. Examine the stimulus, then begin writing. Okay, I would do one question at a time. So read the question, then read the stimulus for that question. Be clear on what you need to address and see if you can find it in your reading time. And then, of course, when you're allowed to write, then you can begin writing. When you do begin writing, be direct in addressing the question immediately. Just get into it. Don't try and create some waffly page filler nonsense. Just address the question, bring in your examples, link them together cohesively and in a seamless manner. Okay, because it is so important that you are creating a fluid piece of writing. You do this in your modules in your paper 2, so why not do it in your paragraphs for your paper 1, section 1. Okay, and when you're using examples and techniques, don't repeat metaphor throughout your paragraph. Okay, if you're going to talk about the use of metaphors by the composer, bring in your technique and metaphor, then bring in your examples that are metaphors, then move on to the next one. Okay, use a variety of techniques within your short answer responses, and do not base your response on one sole technique. Okay, so if you need to go back, and revise your visual techniques, your literary techniques, your poetic devices, and convey how these shape meaning in answering the question. It's important to look at all of these techniques and devices because you do not know what type of stimuli you're going to get for the paper 1, section 1. Okay, and so important. There's nothing worse than seeing a student who is done extremely well for the first 3 or 4 questions, but then doesn't even answer the 5th question. So finish each question. Do not leave any question unanswered. Okay, but make sure that you work within the time constraints. Don't go over time. Okay, do not go over time. Okay, you got 90 minutes writing time. You got 45 and 45 for section 1, section 2. So if you can shave time off section 1 so that you can use that in section 2, fantastic. Okay, but whatever you do, do not go over time in one section. Okay, and look, finally, look, the general rule. Okay, I'm not saying that this is the golden rule and it's set in stone, but the general rule and the expectation from markers within the center is that if it's a 3-mark question, you should aim for 2 examples with techniques. If it's a 4-marker, aim for 3 examples with techniques. If it's a 5-marker, 4 examples with techniques. 6-marker, 5 examples, etc., etc. Okay. So look, I know there's a lot to take in here in this seminar video. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact your class teacher or myself to clarify any issues that you may have. But please take this advice on board and best of luck in your prep for paper 1, section 1.